My name is William Eric Waters. I currently work for Wildcat Service Corporation, which is an organization founded almost 50 years ago. And it was one of the first organizations in the nation to specifically have a mission to help people leaving prisons and jails find employment. Most of it was transitional employment, but some of it was also permanent employment. And of course, the organization does much more 50 years later than it did when it was initiated, but it still has that core mission to help people in transition from prisons and jails find employment at a sustainable wage. I first met Bill Weber in the early 90s, and I had a connection with him a little before that because I was among a number of students chosen for the first cohort of the Master Professional Studies degree program, which started in Sing Sing in 1982. So I encountered him then in 1982, and for a number of reasons, mostly Doc's policies, I did not end up in that first cohort, the class of 1983. Fast forward 10 years later, I ultimately was accepted for the program, as I was the initial time when I applied for the program. But NYTS has to work hand in hand with the Department of Corrections and Community Supervision, where NYTS may like you as a student and you pass all of the academic standards that it's looking for, and docs, for whatever reason, may say, well, at this moment, we're not going to transfer this person to Sing Sing prison. Well, depending on where you're at, right? Up the river or down the river. So at that time, I was more up the river, so I would have had to come down the river to be at Sing Sing, literally on one of the buses that people in prison still call boats. So I met Bill Weber fleetingly in 1982, and then once again, we were reunited in 1993. I'm a graduate of the class of 94, the NPS program, which is offered at Sing Sing prison, which people like to call it now the North Campus. I have some things about that, but Bill Weber, and because I have an understanding of his initial engagement with wanting to bring the master's program into Sing Sing, I have a little bit of that history. And so when it first began, Bill Weber came out of nowhere, at least for the people in prison. No one knew him. He didn't have any cred with people in the prison system. And it was Reverend Ed Muller, who was a prison chaplain, who basically gave Bill Weber some of his cred, because in the very beginning, there were, before people even had that understanding of the hermeneutics of suspicion, people suspected Bill Weber. Some thought he was a CIA agent or something. So, which was really funny, because we would jokingly, when he would say that we could ultimately be agents of change, we said, yeah, he must be a CIA agent, right? But Bill knew that there was really something special that we as a society locked up in our total institutions, our prisons, our mental health institutions. And Norman Mailer, in his introduction to In the Belly of the Beast, which was a book written by Jack Henry Abbott that was on the New York Times bestseller list in the early 80s, Norman Mailer wrote in his introduction, when we think of locking people up, we think that we lock up the worst of the worst. He said, but we also lock up the most enterprising, the boldest, and even the most intelligent people, normally the urban poor, young Black men and young men of color specifically. So I think Bill Weber was also able to see that, and Reverend Muller, who had created what he called Exodus, which was a study group created at Greenhaven Prison in 1972, had already seen the possibilities of theological education in the prison setting. And I believe one of his study papers for Exodus was by Frantz Fanon, and it was The New Man. So I think both Ed Muller and Bill Weber saw that prison could be used as this crucible to form not a new man, because these men already existed, but help them come into their power. One of the good things about Bill Weber is that as the president emeritus of NYTS, he was very humble. You know, you would never hear him talk about any of his credentials. But one of the really good things about Bill Weber is he understood as a Christian that when he came into prison, it wasn't simply about proclaiming the word. It was about being in fellowship with men in prison. And he was really big on koinonia, forming the sense of community wherever you find yourself, even if you find yourself up the Hudson River in Sing Sing. And Bill Weber really fostered that. But another thing about Bill Weber was he had this knack to be able to get into your head, to pull things out. And he would recommend a book to every student after a month or two based on reading our journals. So Bill Weber had this knack to really get into the minds of the people that he was in fellowship with. And after reading your journals, he would recommend a book that he really thought you would benefit from. And I graduated in 1994, so more than 25 years later, I remember the book he recommended my first semester, and I remember the book he recommended my second semester. And both books were books by the late Professor Derek Bell. The first one was Faces at the Bottom of the Well, and the second one was And We Are Not Saved. And these were books that Bill just was spot on. These were books that, one, I appreciated. Two, I could really identify with this really great mind of this Black professor who taught at Harvard Law. And Bill, it wasn't just me, everybody in the class, he hit them with the book that spoke to them who they were and who they could become and what they could take out of this particular learning. So Bill was prophetic in many ways, but he was really good at seeing beyond the green uniform that people in prisons wear and could get into your mind. And I think he could also get into people's souls.
What was the vibe amongst your class, your classmates, and with the other professors during those years, during those early years of the program? What were people talking about, dreaming about during those days as you were going through this program? What did you think about, getting a master's from a seminary? What were your thoughts in those days?
Well, many people had already been engaged in self-improvement, and education is a big part of self-improvement. And this was the next step in education in a prison setting. And I remember at graduation saying that this was the mountaintop experience in terms of education offered in a prison setting. But that the challenge would be when you are in prison, which is this valley of dry bones, and you've seen the mountaintop, what happens after you've been to the mountaintop? And the challenge to continue to be engaged, and Bill Weber stayed engaged with people after they graduated, I think, so we would not fall into the valley of dry bones, which was one of the things, of course, Ezekiel 37 that Bill Weber had us read. So he understood that prison could be this valley of dry bones, but also that these dry bones could come to life, and that we would be introduced to something that would ultimately, at least in my eyes, was a mountaintop experience. And I knew the valley was down there because I rose up from the valley, and my challenge was, how do I not fall back into that valley? Because there was still a lot of dry bones that did not come together, that did not come to life. Some of us found life, and I think Bill Weber, he gave us the breath of life in his teachings but more so in his presence. And I think a big part of prison ministry, and I've been really critical of prison ministry because I think fundamentally people who are involved in prison ministry don't understand simply the ministry of presence, to be present, to be in fellowship. And one of my fellow seminarians, Mark Graham, he said, you know, you have many people, Christians specifically, who are involved in prison ministries, and they come in and intentionally or not, they treat people in prison as second-class Christians. And if they are of other faiths, second-class Muslims. Maybe the Quakers were the only ones who would look to be truly in community with people. And I think did not treat people, did not come with that air of, I'm a first-class Quaker and, you know, you are the natives that we're bringing the word to.
So you are obviously somebody who has life, one of those people who whoever breath, you know, help to breathe life into. If you don't mind, I think I'm fascinated by your poetry, and a lot of people watching this would have seen the reading of your poetry. How did that? How did you get into poetry and the writing of poetry? And where did that formation and education come from?
I think of myself first and foremost as a poet, although I pretty much made my bones writing letters to editors and writing guest editorials around issues of crime and punishment. But at heart, I'm a poet. And I remember a friend telling me that everybody did this, that people would write poetry, but they would steal the poetry of others. And I said, I never stole the poetry of others. And if I used a line from somebody, obviously, you know, anybody who reads poetry and likes poetry would understand where it comes from. But my engagement as a writer came about because I had some friends who were involved in the criminal legal system. And I say that intentionally because it's not a justice system. And I think the founder fathers say we are a nation of laws. So we do have a criminal legal system. And I remember a friend of mine running afoul of the law, and I knew exactly what happened. And a day or two later, I read about it in the newspaper, and I knew it was totally inaccurate. I just didn't know if it was intentionally and deliberately inaccurate. And at that point, and I think I was 15 years old, I came to understand that if you did not tell your story, somebody else would tell it for you. And it wouldn't be your story once somebody else told it, because they would have a particular point of view. And in matters of crime and punishment would not be fair to the person involved in any kind of illegal activity. But I think as a poet, and Steinbeck, I believe, said this, that many people, when they get the writing bug, they say they want to be a poet. And they start out writing poetry and they figure out quite quickly it's one of the most demanding forms, and they move on to the short story, and some kind of wrap their mind around that, but still others move on and eventually write novels. But I've stayed there first and foremost as a writer, as a poet. And I don't think you're born a poet. I think you develop a love for poetry and you cultivate it, and you write. I write, therefore I am. And being a writer, especially a writer in prison, it gives you a sense of identity other than inmate blank.
Mm-hmm.
I think everybody in the prison system, at least in New York State, if you didn't know them, you would think their first name is inmate. They would be called inmate and then their last name. But when you are able to assume an identity, somewhat a professional identity, and the people in prison and the people running the prison, they actually identify you as, he's the writer. I think you have come into your own because they see you as someone other than a person in prison. He's the writer.
Who's your favorite poet?
My favorite poet is Shakespeare, but I love Maya Angelou.
Mm-hmm.
And she's probably the only poet that I know a number of her poetry by heart. And I think, as a poet, and as many poets, she really understood not just rhyme, but meter. And she did not write about esoteric stuff. She wrote in her poetry about relationships, about becoming, her famous poem, Phenomenal Woman. But my favorite by her is Still I Rise. And in Still I Rise, it's a poem, of course, but it's also a history lesson. You may write me down, right? If you remember those verses.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, for anybody watching, if you have not heard Eric read his poem, you should go watch that video. Getting back to Bill Weber, when they gave him the honorary doctorate at Yale University, they called him a prophet for the cause of justice. Right? You've known him for many years. Before and after you came home, was he still alive after you?
Yes.
Yeah. So
yes.
you hang out with him after he.
We did hang out.
Yeah. So tell us, as his student and his friend and colleague, right, a fellow professor at NYTS now, somebody who knew him so well, why do you think they call him a prophet for the cause of justice? And give us some stories, some anecdotes of how you saw that, right, lived out in him.
I mean, as you know, I believe Bill Weber, he probably could have lived anywhere in New York City, but he chose to live in East Harlem and raise his children in East Harlem. And I think he's a prophet for a number of reasons. He saw the writing on the wall, whether you're looking at the graffiti in the inner cities in New York City or anywhere in the world, actually. They wrote graffiti in the pyramids in Egypt. But Bill Weber had this strong sense of justice, I believe, similar to the strong sense of justice that the late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King had also. And Bill introduced us to those 8th century BCE prophets who had this real strong sense of justice. And I think Bill's strong sense of justice, of course, is rooted in the gospel. When I say the gospel, I really mean the Old Testament and those 8th century BC prophets. And I think part of his commitment to justice was being with and in fellowship among those who might be considered by the larger society as the least among us. And I don't think Bill saw anybody as the least among us. And if people were identified as the least among us, those would be the people that Bill Weber would be in fellowship with. So I think he may have taken it a step further than the 8th century BCE prophets.
Wow, that's great. That's great. Anything else you want young people to know about Bill Weber and the legacy that he left behind?
Well, I think part of Bill Weber's enduring legacy, when you look at the roster of the NPS alumni, many of them, not just one, not just two people, but they have went on to do really great things. And I think in the spirit of Bill Weber, somewhat like after one of his books, Led by the Spirit. I mean, Bill was truly led by the Spirit, and meeting some of his friends, they would say Bill was like the closest thing to a saint that they knew. But I think it's not about canonizing Bill as a saint, because he was more a prophet and not a saint. And Bill would do things because if you do any work in the prison system, you, for the most part, have to toe a particular line. And prison is really tough for people who are intellectual because there are so many rules that don't make sense. Angela Davis said, jails are thoughtless places, thoughtless in the sense that no thinking is done by the administrators, and that the void created by this absence of thought is filled with rules and the fear of establishing a precedent. So Bill found a way to get around those rules that did not make any sense. He called it Christian manipulation. And because he did it, because he was led by the Spirit, and you look at what he would do, it wasn't a misdemeanor or a felony. It was just something he believed that had to find a way into the prison system so it could find its way into the hearts and minds of the men in prison that he was in koinonia with.